Hello, and welcome to class. You probably heard last week the 911 Commission has certified that this class has no links to Al-Qaeda, so just wanted to confirm that, okay? We're going to continue our intellectual discourse today on the Cold War, the origins of the Cold War, and talk a little bit about the repercussions of this Cold War at home. And we started last week by talking about the role of organized labor in containing the left. And I think this is really important. It's something that you don't read about a lot in the standard texts on the Cold War, but it's really critical because labor is supposed to be kind of a force for progressivism, and much of the reform legislation that the United States has is a result of labor agitation, things like minimum wage laws and child labor laws and workplace safety laws and things like that. At the same time, labor actually is a force to promote America's overall economic, if not imperial, agenda in Europe. And they do this by actually subverting labor unions abroad. Now, I think that also has a consequence at home. In the long term, labor, by giving their allegiance to this kind of aggressive, hegemonic foreign policy, really gets taken for granted at home. And so the U.S. really is the only industrialized state that doesn't have the kind of welfare or reform legislation that other industrialized countries do, things like national health insurance or kind of a determining voice in workplace issues and things like that. So I think it really has great consequence for the Cold War, and the AFL and CIL were really part of that hegemonic foreign policy, especially in Europe after the war, and that's really important with regard to the way the Cold War is waged at home. Another thing that's really important has become a real lightning rod for critics on both the left and the right is the establishment of what today is often referred to as the national security state, and I began talking a little bit about that. It occurs in 1947. Congress passes the National Security Act. Now, on one hand, the National Security Act is kind of a bureaucratic act. It creates an independent Air Force, whereas the Air Force used to be part of the Army. It creates the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, rather than the Department of War. It creates the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, which supersedes the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. And the CIA is supposed to gather foreign intelligence, all right? It ends up having a much larger role than that. I think we know a little bit about the CIA. But on one hand, it's just a bureaucratic, act, bureaucratic laws. But it's something much bigger than that. Why? I mean, it becomes a lightning rod. Critics claim that it creates a militarized state, what they often refer to as a garrison state. The National Security Act creates a permanent and large military establishment. You remember I said last week, before World Wars I and II, the U.S. essentially had to mobilize and draft people very quickly. There were very small armies, right? What the National Security Act tries to do is basically to keep that on a permanent basis. It's based on the idea that the world has entered a new era, an era of total war, and especially an era in which nuclear missiles can destroy entire societies in a matter of hours. There's atomic bombs and there's jet aircraft and there's these huge armies, standing armies on borders and things like that. So a nation has to be ever ready, ever mobilized and prepared to wage war with, just like hardly any notice at all. As a result of that, you can't simply have a kind of a standing army. You have to have kind of a more militarized society. You have to link both military and civilian sectors to be ever ready to promote the nation's security. All right. One of the leading military theorists at the time was an admiral who was very influential in the Pacific War, Ernest King, and he said, "Wars are no longer fought solely by the armed forces. Directly or indirectly, the whole citizenry and the entire resources of the nation go to war." And so the national security state is based on that idea. It creates, as one critic said, a large and onerous federal structure, either influenced too much or controlled by military needs, with the loss of liberty at home because of this new garrison state. It leads to a militarized budget where the Department of Defense gets vast amounts of money. Far more money is spent in peacetime on the military than ever even imagined before. $4 trillion between 1945 and 1989 is spent on the Pentagon, which is just a staggering amount of money, military contracts and interventions, and if you take in associated things like the space program, NASA, which was has a great deal of military application, then the numbers are even much higher. So budgets are directed toward the Pentagon. It also creates kind of a militarized state, what critics charged a Garrison State. Think of things like the Patriot Act or the Department of Homeland Security. Right? That's part of the national security state. It's not just, we're going to have a lot of soldiers and a bunch of weapons that we can fire. We're going to have a bunch of airplanes. It's much more than that. It's Homeland Security. It's Code Orange. It's you might be dangerous. It's we don't know if we should let you on an airplane. That's all part of the national security state. So it really is this really comprehensive development, which really has incredible consequences for not just the post-war era, but into the present. I mean, one could probably argue the national security state today is stronger than it has been even in the Cold War era. It's really, quite imposing when you think about it. You had McCarthyism, and then you had COINTELPRO in the 60s going after groups like the Weather Underground or SDS or the Black Panthers. And then today, with this massive explosion of government power. And it's kind of ironic, and what I'm going to talk about in a minute is the harshest critics of this were actually conservatives, Republicans, quite often. Because what are Republicans supposed to be against? Government, big government, right? And what is the National Security Act? It's big government. What is the Patriot Act? It's big government. What's Homeland Security? So basically what you have are these conservatives creating these government structures which have more and more and more impact in your lives. And so other conservatives often are the harshest critics of them. Okay, many called it a Prussianization of American life. Prussianization. What does that mean? A militarist society, a militarist culture, right? I mean, you start having, flyovers at baseball games, and everything is kind of structured in such a way that there's some kind of a military application to it. The kind of GI Joe dolls, which become really popular after World War II. It becomes kind of people build underground shelters because they're afraid of the bomb, and civil defense. All that becomes part of what critics would say is the Prussianization. Probably the biggest critic at the time, my favorite conservative, probably my favorite Republican ever, was a guy from Ohio, a senator named Robert Taft. And Taft was an incredible critic of this. And it's really striking because Taft, he was known as Mr. Republican. His father was president, grandfather was president, William Howard Taft. His son, his grandson, I think, is currently the governor of Ohio. Tafts are well known. I grew up in Ohio, and there was always a Taft who was a governor or a senator or something, mayor of this city or that. So Taft has the strongest Republican credentials one could imagine. He had run for president for the Republican nomination. He was defeated by Eisenhower in '52. He may have run in '48 against Dewey. I can't recall. But Taft was also believed that Republicanism stood for certain ideas, that conservatism stood for certain ideas, that America stood for certain ideas, like the government should not be involved in your life, that people should be at liberty, at least white people. Taft also voted against, I think, every civil rights bill that ever appeared before Congress, too. But he believed, that there was a certain liberty at stake here, that people had to be free to act upon their own interests, and that they shouldn't have the state coming down and forcing them to register for the draft or to be in the army or anything like that. So he believed that the national security state was this signal to the world that the U.S. is going to be meddling, really deeply involved in world affairs with this new military and these experts like the National Security Council, which is part of the National Security Act, creates a National Security Council, right? Experts to give advice to the president, right? Interventionist arms like the CIA, which we'll find out about, either today or next time. The CIA, the wing of the government that helps overthrow governments in Guatemala and Iran and Chile and many other places. So Taft is really upset by all this. He said this can only lead to the United States becoming deeply involved in meddling and fighting wars all over the globe. And that isn't what we do. We're supposed to take care of things here at home. We're supposed to promote our liberty, promote economic development, right, to have that kind of a state. He said, if we have this national security state, production will be geared toward military needs. Budget will be geared toward military purchasing. We'll have economic decisions and economic controls based upon our military needs. We will lose freedom. We will lose economic and political freedoms because of this militarized culture. This is coming from a Republican. Taft says the U.S. has to be careful not to become imperialist, and that's his word, who are ready to take a provocative stand on every controversial issue or attack every country in the world. And this sounds like, at the time, the best-known left-wing critic of the Cold War was Henry Wallace. He had been vice president under FDR up to 44, from 40 to 44, and then Truman took over as vice president. Truman becomes president when Roosevelt dies. And Henry Wallace was a critic of the Cold War. He was a critic of Truman, and he would say things like this. But by that time, it's easy to dismiss Wallace. He's a crank, he's a Bolshevik, don't listen to him. So he kind of didn't have a whole lot of credibility. It's a lot harder to pull this on Robert Taft. So when Taft says, the U.S. is full of imperialists and they're going to act in this provocative way, it's harder to dismiss. Taft says, if the United States continues on this path toward having a large military establishment, toward having a large standing army, toward spending a lot more money on the Pentagon, toward having weapons aimed at, enemy countries all over the world. If this continues, this is what Taft says, our fingers will be in every pie. Our military forces will work with our commercial forces to obtain as much of world trade as we can lay our hands on. That's worth repeating because this is coming from Robert Taft, Mr. Republican. Our military forces will work with our commercial forces to obtain as much of the world trade as we can lay our hands on. We will occupy all the strategic strong points in the world and try to maintain a force so preponderant that none shall dare attack us. Potential power over other nations, however benevolent its purposes, leads inevitably to imperialism. That's quite striking. Yeah. I can email it. I can put it out. Yeah. So Taft then, clearly, and Taft represents, this isn't just, Taft by himself is very important, but he represents, a fairly significant element in the Republican Party. Now, this gets back to the point I made at the very beginning. The Cold War and these associated programs are all products of liberalism. These are liberals who are doing this. Truman and the Democratic establishment who is creating this national security state are liberals, all right? Now, liberalism, this is the contradiction. Liberalism becomes coercive, right? Liberalism is supposed to be based on freedom, the idea that people will choose markets and choose to have these kinds of freedoms. But in fact, it doesn't work that way, as we increasingly see. There are other forces in the world. First of all, there's communism, of course. There had been fascism before the war. But then there are others who seek, and we'll see this increasingly as we talk, about Latin America, as we talk about Asia. There are others who seek their own kind of sovereign path, all right? So liberalism can't find markets that way, so it becomes coercive. So these are liberals. The critique is coming from the right, from Taft and others like that, who are saying this is imperial, this is imperialism. So it really, it's important, I think, to kind of understand this, to get a real sense of how these trends have developed over time, right? It's always struck me that Republicans attack Democrats as being soft and wishy-washy and dovish and weak and gutless and cowards and chickens and all that kind of stuff. This is the most aggressive foreign policy imaginable, and it's a liberal product. It's a liberal product. And in fact, some of the most effective critiques have come from the right, not just Taft, but today, people like Pat Buchanan, George Will, a lot of these military people who have been criticizing the war. So it's something I think that really needs to be understood within a much larger social historical context. As part of the national security state, Truman proposed universal military training, permanent standing army, which Taft, of course, criticized. Taft believed that the president had far too much power in this new national security state, that this would lead to what would later be called, especially under Nixon, the imperial presidency, right? Because, nowadays, look at the amazing amount of power that a president has to make decisions like peace and war. Think of in the ramp up to World War II. FDR has neutrality acts, and he has to go to Congress to get a Selective Service Act passed, and then he has to do cash and carry and lend-lease. It's really an incremental process. And at each step of the way, he's being challenged, and he goes to Congress. So Congress essentially has a check on him. compare that to Vietnam, where these were executive decisions, or the current war, which was based on deceptions, and undeniably it was based on deceptions. Now, I mean, we have the proof, we have the papers, as Gil Scott-Heron would say, right? So, I mean, this is what Taft and the conservatives foresaw, that the president would have so much power that he can make these decisions basically unilaterally, just steamroll. You get a vote, but you withhold information, or you don't even need a vote, right? So this is really a problem. Other conservatives agreed with Taft. A senator from Indiana named William Jenner said that the national security state is going to lead America to a military dictatorship. And he didn't even necessarily mean people in uniform, but a militarized society. John McClellan, senator from, I believe, Alabama, said that the National Security Act would create a world garrison state dominated by international institutions and a militarized culture, and that will destroy the American way of life. John Bricker, also from Ohio, a conservative Republican, said, "We can wipe out all traces of communism in the world, but if we lose the Constitution, we're doomed to slavery." So this is the right-wing attack on the national security state. And I think it's really worth talking about. I mean, I spent a little bit of time on it, but I think it's really vital to understand that at the outset there were critics of this, that this is a liberal institution. These are liberal creations, and that's really important to understand. That the point of all this, as Taft said, was to have a military force capable of going out, what did he say, with commercial forces to get trade all over the world. This isn't some Marxist left-wing history professor somewhere saying this. This is Robert Taft saying the point of that national security state was to create a militarized culture to go out and dominate world trade. What did George Kennan say? What did George Kennan say? We have 6% of the world's population, control 50% of the resources, and what is our task in the coming period? To devise new patterns of relationships to maintain this, all right? So, I mean, sometimes, take these guys at their word. They're honest about what they want. And this is clearly, I look at Atchison, if we want to maintain the American way of life, we have to find these markets. Remember the Soviet, the Maisky, Litvinov, Gromyko analyses in 44 and 45. The U.S. is going to try to create a new imperialism based on free trade in the dollar. Bretton Woods, dollar, IMF, okay? All of these things are structured in these ways. They work the same way. These are all part of the same pattern. You can't separate them. It's like a big cell, and you can't really, just take the good parts out and leave the bad, So it's really important, I think, to understand this in a larger structure that way. And it's brilliant. I mean, when you think about it, it takes a great deal of foresight and intelligence and understanding to create this system. And it all ties in together, the National Security Act and the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine and Bretton Woods, and boom, all right? So much for my little sermon there. Okay, all of this is built up to what I think is arguably the most important aspect of the early Cold War years, and that's the creation of what I call a military Keynesian state, which comes to its kind of maturation in a document titled NSC 68. Has anybody ever heard of NSC 68? No, one person has. Has anybody ever heard of the U.S. Constitution? All of you have heard of that, right? NSC 68, in its own way, is kind of a modern-day equivalent, I think, to the importance of the Constitution. It's not a document that's voted on or binding or anything like that. It's essentially an analysis and a policy document. But it is, in the Cold War era, basically a foundation block for what proceeds, what follows afterward. I'm sorry, not precedes it. The national security state increasingly militarizes American foreign policies and its economic priorities. And Pentagon budgets, as we'll see, go up dramatically, exponentially from that period on. New bureaucracies are created, like the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Council. They are there to kind of safeguard American interests around the world, the CIA. But there's also an economic basis, not surprisingly, for this too. National security, the National Security Act, is an incredible justification. It's a powerful justification, right? Why are you doing whatever it is you're doing? For reasons of national security, for reasons of state. One of Noam Chomsky's more powerful books is called For Reasons of State. And the point there is that one can justify a lot of things for reasons of state. We're under attack, terrorists are out to get us, they have nuclear weapons, they're terrorists, whatever. for reasons of state, all right? But that's often kind of a part of a shell. And what's really important is what interests are being served in promoting particular ideas. And clearly, you know, the National Security Act comes along with an amazing increase in defense spending, in military spending. This becomes a strategy, a national economic strategy. Military spending is more than a way to promote the nation's security. It is, I think, the most important economic strategy of the post-war era. And it's really vital that way. Remember how I briefly mentioned last week about the one author, Frankowski, who said that the reason behind the war scare and the Berlin crisis and the Marshall Plan was actually to justify spending a whole lot more money on airplanes to bail out the aircraft industry. The idea there is we can use defense spending as a way to correct the economy. Now, we talked about Keynes earlier. Remember, Keynes talked about using government spending as a way to stabilize the economy, to keep the economy stable. Now, Keynes in particular was talking about keeping people employed. And Keynesianism and advocates of Keynesianism, liberals, believed that what you had to do was use the state to promote economic activity. How do you do that? By creating public works projects. The New Deal is a good example of that. You build roads, you build bridges, and it's done publicly, not privately. All right? Well, especially after World War II, remember, what's the IMF and the World Bank structure? Private, right? IMF and World Bank money has to be spent through private institutions. The Marshall Plan has to be spent privately. The Marshall Plan doesn't give money to a state-run corporation. The IMF doesn't give you money to go build a state-run media or a state-run network or anything like that. It's privatized. And so in the post-war era, in order to avoid a repeat of the depressions of the 20s and the 30s, you have to find some way of promoting economic activity, but not through these public spheres which would redistribute power and wealth. How do you do this? How do you do it? What is the one thing that everyone agrees the government, the federal government, has to do? What do they have a responsibility for? National defense, military, right? So what you do is you take Keynesianism, which essentially, you know, people accept, and you give it a military emphasis. So it's military Keynesianism, all right? This it's essentially pretty much the same as the military-industrial complex. The idea there isn't just we need to have a strong permanent military establishment to protect us from all our enemies. It's we need to have a constant source of government expenditures in order to keep the economy moving and expanding, but without giving in to public sources and without redistributing power or influence to the people. So that's important. How do you do it? You spend money on the military. And NSC 68 does that. American leaders in the post-war era choose to use this awesome power of the federal government to keep the economy growing via contracts, defense expenditures, subsidies, arms sales, and occasionally even wars. Right? 62% of the federal budget was invested in military spending in the early decades of the Cold War, both directly and peripherally, indirectly. More money is spent on things like the Atomic Energy Commission, Veterans Administration, NASA, all of which have military applications. So the government spends billions of dollars, hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars on this, hundreds of billions of dollars in foreign aid programs, often which have a military application. It sets up programs in order to train military officials from other countries, like the School of the Americas at Fort Benning. So you have these programs that are, kind of like, bringing in, the exchange students, thinking like bringing in Fez. Instead, you're bringing in, generals and torturers from other countries who come in and get trained in the United States. So all of this becomes part of this military Keynesian national security state. I mean, a lot of kind of conspiracy theorists spend a lot of time on this, and almost like it's this, five-headed, monster. It's actually done in the open. It makes sense. I mean, it's not some kind of secret conspiratorial group that sits around like in Bilderberg and they hide in their little gnomes or anything. It's done in the open. It's the way the system was set up. We have a national security state. We convince people that their security is at risk, and in order to defend that security, we spend trillions of dollars on weapon systems, even though we know the enemy isn't really going to attack us. I mean, you know, I think, you know, we've talked about that already, and there's more to it. I'll say more today. Nobody really believes at this time that the Soviet Union is poised to attack the U.S. unless the Americans spend trillions of dollars on weapons. No one's saying that. No one's saying that. All right. However, NSC 68 is saying that. All right. I shouldn't say no one's saying that. No one who really knows, no one who really believes is saying that. But NSC 68 does. So what's NSC 68? National Security Council. National Security Council writes papers, you know, giving the president advice. That's what they're set up to do. And so the 68th paper they wrote came out in April of 1950. So they called it NSC 68, NSC number 68, National Security Council paper number 6. That's all it is. And it does a couple things. It's a critically important document. I would argue the most important document. And more than that, NSC 68 is generally seen, well, it does two things. Let me do it that way. It does two things. The first one is the one that people kind of talk about all the time. It offers a powerful statement on the Cold War and America's ideology and America's place on the Cold War. And it sounds like a messianic document about good and evil. The United States, you know, is preserving democracy against the horrible tyranny of the Soviet Union. It talks about the Soviet Union's design for world conquest. And if you read it, it's very thin. I mean, it makes all these incredible claims about the USSR, but there's nothing really of substance there to kind of back it up. So the Soviet Union has designs for world conquest, but it doesn't say how or what it's done to make one believe that. It says, finally, to kind of make a long story short, the Cold War is a conflict of, and this is NSC 68's author saying, it's a conflict of, quote, the slave society with the free. You don't get any more stark than that, right? The Soviet Union with the dark hats and the kind of grim reaper scythe in their hand, and, you know, the United States, the free society, all that is good with the flowing robes and Mother Nature and flags and all that kind of stuff, right? So it's really stark. I mean, it reads like something that you would see in one of these, you know, kind of militia sites or something like that on the internet, right? All right. So this is the part we hear about. NSC 68 was so frightened by the Soviet Union that it encouraged a new approach to foreign policy, kind of a permanent military establishment, a lot of money spent on military and things like that. All right. So that's kind of the standard text on it. Less discussed, however, which I think is actually more important, is that NSC 68 is principally an economic document. And I would argue it is the economic document for the Cold War because it rationalizes a way to spend zillions of dollars on the military as a way to promote national economic activity. NS 68 advised against negotiations with the Soviet Union. After talking about how evil they were, you know, it also says, well, but we shouldn't talk to them to try to, you know, make a better situation. It advises against it. Instead, it recommends a massive military buildup and as much tax increase as you need to pay for it. So, you know, critics of NSC 68 would say, well, how are you going to pay for all this? You raise taxes, right? It recommends a massive military buildup, sizable tax increases to support it, reductions in social programs because that money needs to be redistributed, redirected toward the Pentagon, massive civil defense spending on civil defense programs, domestic loyalty requirements, media support for propaganda at home, psychological warfare and propaganda programs in communist countries, the development of a hydrogen bomb program, and alliances everywhere you can find them. This is NSC 68's prescription. That's pretty big stuff. Basically, it's the national security state writ large. It's exactly what the critics of the national security state feared most, right? Permanent spending on the Pentagon, tax increases to support it, cuts in programs at home that might cut into spending that could be better used on the Pentagon, domestic loyalty requirements, civil defense programs. All right, this is, you know, what Taft and others talked about. This is the Garrison State that they feared. Why is that? Is it because the U.S. is so threatened by outside forces? At the time, communism. Today, Arab terrorism, Muslim terrorism. It's the kind of thing where you can kind of fit other things into the puzzle. You can take other pieces and fit them in and test it that way too. So, I mean, and the rhetoric is remarkably similar, and the ideas are remarkably similar today. You know, you look at what these guys said about communism. This is 1950. Because of the Soviet Union, because of communism, we have to do these things. Fast forward to 2002 or 2003 or 2004, because of Arab terrorism, because of the Middle East, we have to do these things. I mean, the analysis is similar, and the solution is the same as well. I mean, we have to increase our defense spending. At the time, you had the Smith-McCarran Act and domestic loyalty programs and loyalty oaths and court cases about communism, right? Today, you have Homeland Security and the Patriot Act, very, very similar. So the ideology of the national security state is still very powerful, right? Military Keynesianism is very powerful. I mean, if you look at Reagan, I mean, it's quite ironic because Reagan ran as this kind of fiscal Republican conservative. And what did the guy spend all his money on? It's on the Pentagon. Ran up the biggest deficits in American history through military spending. It's military Keynesianism. It is a way to maintain economic activity via defense spending, via arms, via munitions, right? Why do you do that? Because it keeps people at work, develops a military industrial. It works. I mean, it does. It's an effective program. It creates jobs in the military industrial complex. People are paid fairly well, right? You keep building weapons, so there's generally a lot of work available. Incredible economic activity. Through the GI Bill, people can go to college and become professionals. So in the period after World War II, you have this massive economic expansion. People are able to move to the suburbs and buy a home, and they can go to college. The kind of stuff no one could have imagined before, especially during the Depression, right? So, I mean, it works. It's an effective economic program to develop economic opportunities for people, right? It also creates amazing wealth, right? And you couple this with these foreign programs like the IMF or the Marshall Plan, which force countries receiving Western aid to turn around and spend it in those associated countries through offsets and counterparts. And what do they often spend it on? What is the biggest export that the U.S., one of the biggest exports the U.S. is making? It's weapons, it's arms, right? I mean, every year the United States is the number one, we talk about arms, proliferant arms dealers. If you look at the statistics, every single year in the Cold War, the U.S. is overwhelmingly the largest exporter of weapons. Why is that? It's if you're exporting weapons to both sides. Later on, we'll talk about South Asia, India and Pakistan. Guess who arms both India and Pakistan? The U.S. armed both sides, right? So, why do you do that? Does that promote American security? After the Vietnam War, when defense spending had to be cut because the war was winding down, what did Nixon do as a substitute? He started selling arms all over the globe. American arms sales, especially to the Third World, went up dramatically. Why is that? Is that for security reasons? Are you more secure by arming everybody else? Why do you do that? Why do you do that? Let's... Yeah, use the table mics, I keep forgetting. Right. I mean, you have all these goods and you have money that needs to be invested and you have to find markets and trade. So you sell weapons. That's one thing everybody wants. I mean, if you're a third world dictator, and somebody says, well, I'll sell you all these weapons or I'll sell you some millet, it's an easy call, right? I mean, when James talks about Vietnam, I'm sure he's going to mention the way the regime of Ngo Dinh Diem used American aid. 78% of American aid to the entire country of Vietnam went into Diem's pocket, and he used it for military, spent it on the military. Why? To keep himself in power, right? Yeah. Push the button if you think of it. Oh, okay.
Won't it also create threat further down the road anyway, which will support this?
Yeah, well, it's cyclical, sure. I mean, you're also creating opposition to it. I mean, I think, I don't want to say, the U.S. didn't create Ho Chi Minh or Fidel Castro, but clearly. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, clearly, when you do that, it doesn't bother them. Yeah. I mean, toward the end, I'll talk about Afghanistan. That's a great case study. Who did the U.S. send money? Who did the U.S. arm in Afghanistan? The Taliban, and who else? And who else? Osama bin Laden, right? The Mujahideen got American aid in Afghanistan. You talk about blowback. Yeah, they were right. The third Rambo was about Afghanistan. Osama was a freedom fighter, right? It's blowback, right? Yeah. But the point here, which is kind of going off on one of my Germans have just bombed Pearl Harbor rants, is that there clearly is a much larger basis, and security is essentially a smokescreen. There are no security interests involved to warrant this massive military establishment, this kind of level of military, they just aren't. They just aren't, right? So why do it then? Well, there's a lot more going on. At the time, we're going to talk about one of my favorite concepts. I know it just excites the hell out of you all the time. Is there's a dollar gap going on. Remember the dollar gap? You've heard more about the dollar gap in this class than you ever will before or ever again in your whole life, because no one talks about this stuff. The dollar gap, remember that? This, as much as anything, prompts the United States to seek this massive state-oriented solution to a global economic crisis. Right? If you look at the policy decision for NSC 68 to develop this military Keynesian state, and if you look at the rhetoric and the rationale given for it, outside of the document with this hysterical talk about the slave society and the free, several things stand out. One is that, and I've said this before, if you look at the White House and the State Department and the military, none of these guys are in any particular way, frantic or frightened or alarmed by the Soviet Union. None of them are exactly like, cowering or shivering or frightened. None of them are terribly, deeply alarmed. Even after the Soviet Union successfully tests the atomic bomb, even after Mao Zedong wins, basically people are calm in the U.S. It's not good news, but people are calm. In fact, Truman's defense budget for the year after the Soviet A-bomb test and the Chinese communist victory in the Civil War, Truman's defense budget actually went down. Now, if one had been so terrified and coward, he would have probably increased it, right? But in fact, that's not the case. The rhetoric coming out of Washington wasn't hysterical. Nobody was frantic. No one said, oh no, the sky is falling. They've tested an A-bomb. The Chinese have won the Civil War. Life proceeded. The U.S. had such overwhelming power. They were aware. They were comfortable in their power. They didn't have to prove it, right? So what's going on? Well, there's a massive dollar gap. In fact, Dean Acheson says, this is Dean Acheson in 1940, the Secretary of State in 1949, says, even if there were no Russia, if there were no communism, we would still face very grave problems in trying to exist and strengthen those parts of the free world which have been so badly shaken by the war and its consequences. So what's Acheson saying? Is the problem communism? Is the problem Russia? No, it's rebuilding from the war. That's still the problem. This is only 1949, 1950. The war ends 5 years earlier, right? Do you simply rebuild an entire continent shattered by war? I mean, hell, go to parts of the South in the U.S. They've never recovered from the Civil War. This is tough stuff. When your society's been shattered and devastated, you don't just simply, rebuild like that. This is still the paramount problem facing the world. It's not Russia. It's not communism. It's rebuilding. It's rebuilding from the war. What's the problem? There is still a shortage of dollars in the hands of those people who need to rebuild. All right? They still need dollars. Well, what did the Marshall Plan do? $20 billion. $17 billion. That's a lot of money, right? But they're still rebuilding from the war. I mean, the Marshall Plan, I said in today's terms, would be, $130 billion. That's a sizable amount of money. I think all of us would take that, right? At the same time, that's, considering how massive these problems are, it's not like, a staggering, mind-blowing figure. I mean, think of it this way. The United States is spending far more on military equipment at home than all of Europe is spending on reconstruction, all right? I mean, and those problems are not co-equal. I mean, you have a major industrialized continent which is having less money for its reconstruction than the U.S. is spending on weapons at home, all right? So that $17 billion is clearly important, but at the same time, is it going to simply, kind of solve the problems created by the devastation of World War II? No, not at all. So America's major partners in trading and investment still lack the funds needed to have economic activity on the level they need for rebuilding, for reconstruction. And put very simply, they need money to buy stuff from the U.S. The United States needs to produce goods and sell them abroad, and it can't sell them if the people to whom it would market them have no money, right? I can make a product up here. I can make the best computer in the world. incredible computer. I'm going to sell it to you for $300. But if every single one of you is broke, it doesn't do me any good, right? So I have to find a way to subsidize your consumption, to get money in all of your hands, but give it to you based on the idea that you have to give it back to me. You have to buy my computer, buy my pen, or whatever, right? This is the idea behind it. There's a dollar gap. Europe lacks dollars. We need markets. Let's get them dollars, and in turn, they'll buy our stuff. Everybody's better off that way, right? We're subsidizing Europe's military consumption. Now, if you do that at home, if you give, a single mother money to buy milk for her kid, what's that? That's welfare, right? And which has all kinds of negative connotations because you're living on the public dole. You're irresponsible. You're not a citizen. You're dependent, right? But if you give money to a foreign government in the billions to purchase weapons from you, that's okay. That's national security. Now, if you could somehow have convinced America that the nation's security required you to provide WIC coupons to single mothers, then, you probably would have gotten away with it, right? But that didn't work out that way. You weren't going to create public programs for people who needed to buy milk for their kids. But you can create a public program because the evil Russians are out to get you. And if you don't spend all this money and arm not just the United States, but the whole world, then you're at risk. Okay? And I mean, this sounds like I'm kind of being hyperbolic, but this is exactly the rationale that they use. I mean, this is Atchison. Even if there were no Russia, if there were no communism, we'd still have these problems. This is the Secretary of State. This is a hard-ass Cold Warrior. Atchison was nobody's flunky. I mean, if you line up, the top 10 Cold Warriors, VH1, 100 top Cold Warriors, I mean, Atchison would be up there near the top. He'd be damn close to the top. He and Kennedy and Michael Jackson, I think so. So why then? Because of this dollar gap. Without trade, without significant levels of trade, without economic activity, commercial intercourse, America's economy suffers. This is Wilson. This is Keynes. All right? So the Marshall Plan and other foreign military programs initially attack this problem. What's the point? Is it to save the European people from starvation? Well, yeah, that's nice. But it's to get money into their hands so they can buy stuff from the United States because what did Kennan say? We have 6% of the population, 50% of the market. We need to maintain this position of disparity, all right? This, it's really sad to see kids homeless and hungry, but it's a freaking tragedy if American corporations have to go under because they're not having enough money thrown their way. We have to conjure up a crisis to bail out the aircraft industry. Hey, we'll do it. We have to create this image of the Soviet Union as this ever-powerful, engulfing Moloch set to, eat us up. Hey, we'll do it. What's good for GM and what's good for Martin Marietta is good for all of us, all right? So there are economic problems that need to be addressed. There's a recession going on, all right? Corporations are going under. Workers are getting laid off. It's terrible and, mean and nasty and all that kind of stuff. Britain's restricting imports. They can't buy enough stuff from the U.S. because they don't have money. They want to. They want to buy American stuff. Everybody does. They want jeans and they want Coca-Cola and they want Elvis Presley records and baseballs and all kinds of stuff like that. But they can't. They don't have the money to do it. And in fact, the British are really pissed off because they said, you made us end our imperial system. We had all these colonies and we had this really nice system where they all traded in the pound sterling and you made us open it up for this open door. Now we're broke and we don't even have dollars, So they're saying, what, we're going to withdraw. We're going to go back to our old system. We don't want this world you're trying to build because, you ripped us off, man. You sold us the Brooklyn Bridge, right? So the British are pissed off. In Asia, the Japanese are upset. They have a similar problem going on. China's gone. Japan is supposed to become the workshop of the world, right? But they don't have money to buy anything. There's no equivalent program to the Marshall Plan to get dollars into Tokyo. There was something called the Dodge Plan, which was later, in fact, a smaller program of that. So the issue here in 1950 is the world needs dollars. The world needs dollars. And if the world doesn't get dollars, the American economy is going to continue to suffer. And coming out of the 30s and the global depression, the liberals who run the United States won't tolerate that again. So how do you fix it? How do you fix it? What fixed the Depression? World War II fixed the Depression, right? How do you fix it? Some people are saying, well, let's have a sustained program of economic growth at home through public spending for programs. Give people jobs, give them education, give them a trade. That's public money being spent at the expense of private money. We don't do that in the United States. They do that in godless communist Russia. And I'm not going to sit here and listen to you badmouth the United States of America. So we can't do that. Paul Nitze, who was the principal author of NSC 68, talked about the dollar gap. Nitze said, this is the guy who wrote NSC 68, if the dollar gap weren't reduced, unless you get money into the hands of the Europeans, American exports and financial assistance abroad will be reduced as well. If the Europeans don't have money, then our exports don't get sold. Simple enough. If that happens, if the United States isn't selling the stuff it's produced, what happens to production at home in the U.S.? Production will decline as well, because what's the point of producing goods if no one has enough money to buy them? You know, why would I keep producing $300 computers if none of you are buying them, if none of you have the money? I already have a warehouse full of them, so why buy any more of them? So if you don't have the dollars to purchase goods from the United States, then production in the U.S. will decline, which means that trade will drop even more, right? So once that trade pattern is cut, once that trade pattern is hampered, then the states involved, whether it be Britain or France or Italy or Spain or the United States, all of them will have to try to safeguard their own markets. And how do you often do that? Well, in 1929, what did Herbert Hoover, 1930, what did Mr. Hawley and Mr. Smoot try to do to protect American markets? The most protective, restrictive tariffs. And what happened? Smoot-Hawley was a mess. It didn't make things better. It basically hampered trade even more. So if this trade is reduced because these other people don't have dollars to buy the stuff and production declines and trade declines, then you're likely to try protectionism, which probably won't work. Right? In a free trade world, in an open door world, protectionism actually restricts trade. All right? You can continually revalue your currencies, which is what they did in the 30s, but what did Bretton Woods say about currency? Is it a floating system of world currencies now? What did they do at Bretton Woods? Pegged world currencies to the dollar, which was convertible to gold, right? So you can't have all these currency fluctuations. You won't know what the pound is worth. You won't know what the franc is worth. You won't know what the lira is worth. And all of them will be revaluing their money to make it easier to trade, all right? They'll inflate their currencies, which means you're getting less in return, all right? So if this happens, what's the consequence for the U.S.? Unemployment, up. Standard of living, down. Homelessness, up. Political stability, no longer guaranteed, right? What does Nitze say? Unless the dollar gap is addressed, his conclusion is the economic isolation of the United States would be a hard fact. We got to fix this, all right? This is a global economic problem. It's the same thing Wilson faced in the aftermath of World War I, and what happened? What happened in World War I? What was the fallout from that? The Depression and Hitler, right? Don't want that to happen again. NSC 68 is the answer. NSC 68 is the answer. If you can maintain a sustained and escalating program of military growth, if you can use public monies to continually build more military equipment, to sell more arms, and importantly, to get money into the hands of those people abroad who will in turn use it to purchase the goods you've already produced, then you have an economic strategy. And it's not just like, this isn't stopgap, this is big. This is a big economic strategy. All right? You become an arms supplier to the world, you spend money on arms at home, you create this major national security issue, so that people will continually go along with it. They're not going to say, hey, why are you spending money on, on Korea, or why are you spending money here or there instead of here, here at home? And in fact, the national security state works in such a way that people are generally pretty well off as a result of it, especially white working men, right? Because the government spends so much money on these military contracts, it actually creates jobs, and workers can go in and they can ask for higher wages, and it works. I mean, for a generation, it works quite well. It's the way it's supposed to work. So, what's to complain about? Yeah, you have some of these, these crazy troublemakers talking about money for schools or healthcare or kids or whatever, but by and large, this system works fairly well. And in fact, they do build roads and they build bridges, and there is kind of a lot of infrastructure, and it's the golden age. The golden age is with us, right? This is the way it's supposed to work, right? Obviously there's going to be some flaws, and we'll talk about one of which is what you point out. You're essentially creating the seeds for a lot of mayhem down the road, because you can't sustain this forever, and Vietnam kills it. Vietnam kills it. It's often referred to as the guns and butter approach. You've probably heard that phrase before, haven't you? Guns and butter. Anybody ever heard that? Guns and butter? What's that mean? Push the button if you have one there. Well, no, it's actually much more simple than that. It's guns and butter.
Guns and butter is a policy of paying for your butter through guns. It's militarizing the economy, bringing the butter home to the American middle class.
And it works. It's military Keynesianism. You create such a massive military-industrial complex, if you want to use that phrase, that it actually does create jobs. And people get decent wages, and they have kind of a militarized economy creates jobs in which people can afford butter. All right? The problem there is that guns and butter fails when you actually fight a war. See, guns and butter is good if you're just using the money to build weapons, but when you actually use the weapons in warfare, that becomes a problem, in Indochina. And James and I both will talk about that, because it's something that both of us do. We've studied it. And Vietnam essentially kills this. Vietnam kills the post-war prosperity. It kills the military Keynesian state. Because, once you actually have to fight a war and the war gets prolonged and you keep spending more and more and more money, you inflate the economy, you overheat the economy, and even more than that, because of, and I don't want to get too much into it because this is somewhat complicated, but because of the Bretton Woods system, you essentially force everybody else to pay for your mistakes, and they don't want to. So it does, in a sense, lay the seeds for future problems, yeah?
It relies on a kind of equilibrium.
Yeah.
It knocks it out of whack, is what you're saying.
Yeah, there has to be an equilibrium between guns and butter. And in fact, in Vietnam, guns gets the money, right? All right. So this is what NSC 68 does, and there's a huge boost. NSC 68 gets a huge boost in 1950 when war in Korea starts, and we'll talk about that briefly in a few minutes. But the war in Korea justifies the kind of ideas that NSC 68 laid out. In the budget of 1950, Harry Truman asked for $14 billion for the Pentagon. It's a lot of money. At the time, it was the biggest peacetime budget ever. As soon as the war in Korea broke out, Truman readjusted that and asked for $50 billion. All right? In essence, the war in Korea proved that everything they said about NAC 68 was right. Okay? Stalin was trying to take over the world, and he's starting in Korea, and we'll see there's a lot more to it than that. All right, so Truman more than triples his defense request, 3.5 times increase as a result of Korea, doubles the number of air groups to 100, gets new bases, increases the number of troops in the army by 50% to 4 million. All of this because of Korea. Now, just a few months prior to that, Truman had said that the communist victory in China and the Soviet atomic bomb test, both of which are far more important than Korea, were not enough to justify a defense spending increase. Then NSC 68 comes along, and all of a sudden the war in Korea becomes the justification for a 350% increase from 14 billion to 50 billion in the military budget and all kinds of new weapons procurement. What's really important, though, is money starts pouring in to other countries, into Europe, into Japan. And a lot of these countries, what do they do with the money? Especially Japan's a great test case here. Japan gets a ton of money as a result of NAC 68. What does it do with that? What do the Japanese build? There's really no way you would know this. You ought to know this. What do the Japanese do with all their money? Huh? No, what do they do for Korea, though? William Borden? Yeah. The Japanese immediately begin a massive military production program, and who do they sell these weapons to? South Korea. So Japan takes American dollars, right? They use them to buy a lot of raw materials from the United States, they begin a major program of military production and then sell these weapons to South Korea. And this is really critical in Japan's economic revitalization after World War II. Much of the funding is used to produce military equipment, which is often bought back by the United States. This is often called offshore procurement. And in fact, after the South Korea for that like 2-year period was Japan's biggest market. But throughout the 50s, the biggest market for Japan was, guess who? The United States. It sent dollars to Japan, they built military equipment, and then they sold it back to the U.S. All right? Now you're thinking, something's wrong here. You're giving them money, they're buying stuff, then they're selling it back to you, right? Well, because you've created so much economic activity that essentially you can have this guns and butter system. It works. It works. It works now. Essentially, we're talking about white men who are really the beneficiaries of it. I mean, African Americans are still in jobs that don't pay as well. Unemployment rate's higher. A lot of agricultural work, but for the most part, the system works for a generation. This is when they talk about the miracle of Japanese recovery, the U.S. gives money to Japan. It does this in Europe too. What else does it do? It stations troops there. How does it pay those troops? Dollars. And so what do they do with that money? Where do they spend it? Local economy, right? Whether it be buying, transistor radios or at the local brothel, right? You're putting dollars into circulation in these places. With these dollars, they can purchase more American goods. This is the idea behind it, all right? So this is really critical in rebuilding the world. And it's done through the vehicle of the national security state and through creating this massive, threat. Unless we do this, we're vulnerable. The idea there, okay? So, spent a lot of time on it. Anybody have any questions on? But I mean, this is important stuff. The impact of the Cold War at home. I'll spend a lot less time on McCarthyism because I think you're familiar with that, and the idea there is really fairly clear cut. You create this idea that there are communists everywhere, in Hollywood, in the schools, in the labor unions, wherever. Anybody who talks about peace and justice, if you talk about civil rights, if you talk about women's rights, you're a subversive, you're dangerous, you're not patriotic, you're a communist. And in that way, you keep people in a situation where they're not likely to confront decisions like the ones we just talked about, the national security state, military spending, or anything like that. I mean, the best way to get rid of that is you're a communist, right? You're either with us or you're with them. It's the attitude that's really kind of, I think, contemporary, and it's certainly nothing new, right? Anybody have any questions on this? All right, now we're going to talk a little bit again about the kind of application of some of these ideas in the real world, and we're going to start with Korea. And if just to kind of remind you, this is Korea right here. It's a peninsula. To its northwest, the entire north almost actually, it borders Manchuria, China, and then it briefly borders the Soviet Union too here, and a bit to the east is Japan, all right, going through the Sea of Japan and the Korea Straits, and then so it's right near the Soviet Union, China, and Japan, all right. Korea is an unlikely place for things to happen in the way they did. In 1914, I'll try to give you a really quick background here. In 1914, Japan occupied Korea and then maintained its presence there until 1945, and the Japanese were really brutal. They took over Korea. They actually brought a lot of Korean people into Japan to work in factories. They were basically slaves. They forced Korean women to travel with the Japanese army. They called them comfort girls. They were sex slaves. So the Japanese occupation of Korea, as with Indochina, as with China, as with Malaysia, was really quite brutal. I mean, what the Japanese did to other Asians is far more horrendous than almost anything else that happened in that entire war. Notwithstanding the final solution, of course. Pretty bad stuff. So Korea clearly was beset by this. When the war ended, in 1945, then Korea was cut in half. And where's my... All right. And you can kind of see that's... Korea was cut in half at the 38th parallel. Okay. The southern part was allied with the United States. It was essentially an American client state. The northern part was communist. Right. This wasn't just a coincidence. There had been a resistance movement very active in Korea against the Japanese throughout the entire occupation. And that resistance was led, not surprisingly, by communists. And the leader of the communist resistance was a man named Kim Il-sung. And so in 1945, when the World War II ended, when Japan was defeated, Kim Il-sung assumed that he would become the leader of Korea. However, the United States didn't want, the Western countries didn't want Korea to become a communist country, so they divided it in half. Now, Germany was divided, right? But that makes sense, right? Because Germany was kind of the cause of the war. Korea, not really. Korea was occupied this entire time, but Korea's cut in half. In the north, the communist society is created called the DRK, the Democratic Republic of Korea, and this is led by Kim Il-sung. In the south, another state is essentially created called the ROK, the Republic of Korea, and that's led by Syngman Rhee. Now, this is 1945, but even though the Japanese are gone, the resistance continues. The communists continue the struggle, this time not to get rid of Japan, but what do you think the communists will be fighting for now? Take over unify and take over the whole country, right? So this continues. There are a lot of communist rebels in the south below the 38th parallel. In some regions, the CIA admitted that the communists had taken over and the government lost control. Syngman Rhee had lost control. Most guerrillas in the south had been recruited locally. There was very little indication that either the Soviet Union or China had much of a role to play. This was a guerrilla war. It was a brutal war. Before 1950, over 100,000 Koreans had already been killed. This is prior to 1950, all right? However, beginning in 49, the Republic of Korea and the Americans began kind of a major liquidation campaign. So by 1950, the guerrilla threat in the South had been considerably reduced. You know, sometimes you think, oh, well, there's background, but I think this is important, you know, to understand. This is a war that's already taking place. It's ongoing. 100,000 people have been killed. But 1949, 1950, you start to see Syngman Rhee consolidate control in the South and eliminate the communist insurgents which were trying to overthrow him. Right? That's important. Now, so that's what's going on in Korea. All right, there are two Koreas. Now, what are America's interests in this? In early 1950, somebody asked Dean Acheson, who was the Secretary of State, a question about what America's interests were in the Pacific. And Acheson said, well, you know, we're interested in this area and our security interests are here, here, and here. What was really striking is that when Acheson talked about this, he excluded Korea. Basically, and this was typical, Acheson and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and America's diplomatic and military leaders, when they talked about American interest in Asia, never thought Korea was that important. I mean, Japan is an island. That's far more important. China's already lost. The Soviet Union's there. No one considers Korea terribly vital. It doesn't really have any raw materials or resources. It's not really strategically valuable because it borders China and the Soviet Union. So little Korea isn't going to be really much of a counterweight to China and the Soviet Union. And plus, Japan is far more important. So the United States was never terribly concerned about what happened in Korea. It was never an area of vital interest. It didn't have any real economic interest there or anything like that. However, in mid-1950, Korea becomes very important. On one hand, in April of 1950, NSC 68 had been issued. So NSC 68 says, you know, we have to be vigilant all over the place because, you know, this is a conflict of the slave society versus the free. So events in Korea are part of that, right? It becomes this kind of cataclysmic battle of good and evil. And in mid-June, 1950, June 25th, 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. North Korea crossed the 38th parallel and attacked Southern Korea, the Republic of Korea. The DRK attacked the ROK. All right. Kim Il-sung had been in consultation with Stalin and Mao Zedong about this. However, the attack was conducted by North Korean troops. And in fact, when the United States went to the United Nations to get a declaration of war, the Soviet Union wasn't even there to veto it because they were boycotting the UN because Mao Zedong and the Chinese had not been given a seat there. It's really kind of labyrinthine international politics. At any rate, June 25th, 1950, the Democratic Republic of Korea crosses the 38th parallel. What does the U.S. do? And immediately, Harry Truman has a meeting with his military advisors who all say, we shouldn't do anything there. Okay? Omar Bradley says there's really no reason. He's the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He says there's no reason to have any kind of a war in Korea. It's not worthwhile. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, Bradley and Matthew Ridgway and others all said, look, this isn't a place where we need to fight. So Dean Acheson had earlier said Korea wasn't important, and now, at the outset of the war, the Joint Chiefs of Staff are saying Korea is not important. Nonetheless, Harry Truman decides to make a stand. So he goes to the United Nations, and he will fight in Korea. All right? So the United States is now at war, just 5 years after World War II, in Korea. Truman says, if we let Korea down, the Soviets will keep on going and swallow up one piece of Asia after another. If we were to let Asia go, the Near East would collapse, and then no telling what would happen in Europe. Yeah?
Is this strictly related to the loss of China?
Oh, yeah, definitely. The question is, was it related to the loss of China? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because remember, at home, Truman's getting attacked. He lost China. The U.S. lost China, as if the U.S. ever had China, and as if it, with Kim, Jiang Jiechi there. But quite clearly, in the aftermath of China going communist, Truman is under attack. So, one aspect of it politically clearly is, yeah, he has to take a stand. But also NSC 68 has kind of, Korea and NSC 68 really have to be, considered in connection with one another. They work very closely together. They provide a rationale for each other, right? Why do we need NSC 68? Because the communists are trying to take over Korea. Why do we need to intervene in Korea? Because look what NSC 68 said. So they really work. It's really a nice syncretic relationship. And who was it? Was it Forrestal? You've probably heard the story. One of them, when he finds out about the invasion, crossing the 38th parallel, I forget, it may have been Forrestal who says, this is just what I've been looking for. Kind of like NSC 68, Korea, it's perfect. Justifies everything. We can do whatever we want now, right? I mean, it's kind of like September 11th. I mean, you didn't plan it. It wasn't a conspiracy, to fly those planes in the building. But as soon as it happened, you can get anything you want. The next day, Richard Clark, you'll see that in his book. The next day, they were planning on it. They were making plans to attack Iraq after 9/11, right? So as soon as something like that happens, it just creates a whole new world for you. And you can kind of justify, pretty much anything. And so Korea by itself wasn't important. And Acheson and the chiefs all said as much. But in this new world of NSC 68, boom, man, just think of the money we can get now. We can go to Congress, and there's no way they can turn us down. If we go to Congress and say, we want money to defend Korea, and they say no, what are we going to say? You're communists. You're communist sympathizers, right? So they can't turn them down. So it's really beautiful in the big picture. And Truman knows that. So the United States goes to the UN, gets authorization, and begins the fight. I'm going to go through this really quickly. It's really military history. If you're into military history, it's really kind of interesting stuff. In June of 1950, the North Koreans attacked the South Koreans. I don't know if you can kind of see this over here, but it's really a really rapid war. And by September, a few months later, the North Koreans, the DRK, has captured almost the entire country, all except for this little area here. There's a city called Pusan, and this was referred to as the Pusan perimeter. All right? So in just a very short period of time, June, July, August, mid-September, 3 months, Korea's almost lost. I mean, it's really dire, and it looks like Kim Il-sung will be in charge of the entire peninsula. However, Douglas MacArthur, this is kind of the great military accomplishment of his entire life, and MacArthur was in charge of the UN, actually U.S., but under the flag of the United Nations. If you've ever seen MASH, you should know all this, right? MacArthur in mid-September actually does an amphibious landing here at a place called Incheon, and is able to cut the North Korean lines. And so these North Koreans are isolated, and MacArthur batters them. So and then begins moving northward. It's really a rapid war. So these blue arrows are kind of the counteroffensive. These red arrows are the northern invasion into the south, and then these blue arrows, this is the kind of where he cuts northern lines, and then he begins moving northward very rapidly. The initial goal was to maintain the two Koreas. However, MacArthur's advance is so rapid that he goes to the president and says, we can unify Korea. Truman says, okay. This is important. There's something of a timeline here, because it's later become major controversy. But Truman says, okay. So MacArthur continues going up to the north, right? In October of 1950, he announces that he's going to have the boys home by Christmas. He's going to unify Korea under the leadership of Syngman Rhee. Syngman Rhee was one of Americans' favorites. He was like Zhang Jieshi. He was a Christian. He was well connected in the United States. He was America's man in Asia. Much like Ngo Dinh Diem in Vietnam, who James will talk about. I'm going to steal one of my favorite LBJ stories about Diem. He goes to visit him, and they have a press conference, and LBJ says of Ngo Dinh Diem of Vietnam, this is the Winston Churchill of Southeast Asia. And then he gets on an airplane, and he tells this journalist, Stanley Carr, and I say, shit, man, he's the only boy we got down here. Okay? Well, he's much like Zhang Jieshi or Syngman Rhee in that they are America's clients in Asia. And so they're going to put Syngman Rhee in charge. The only problem is everybody's saying very vocally, including the Chinese, if you go too far, China will come into the war, because they share a border here at the Yalu River, okay? So everyone's telling MacArthur, if you go too far, the Chinese will come into the war on behalf of the North Koreans against the United States. MacArthur's intelligence chief is a guy named Willoughby, General Willoughby, who's a member of the John Birch Society. Ever hear of the John Birch Society? What's the John Birch Society? Yeah, the guy who Oswald also tried to kill. There was a guy in Dallas, General Walker, who was like the head of the John Birch Society, and I believe Oswald wanted to kill him too during the Kennedy thing. The John Birch Society, they're named after like this missionary or something. I'm not sure they even know who John Birch really was. But Willoughby is a John Bircher. And my point here is he's really kind of nuts. And everybody in the entire intelligence community is saying, and the Chinese are very open. They're not even hiding it. This isn't like intercepted messages. The Chinese are publicly saying, if you go too far, we will invade. And Willoughby keeps telling MacArthur, oh no, there's no way, they're bluffing. Everybody in the world is saying. So MacArthur keeps going with Truman's consent, and guess what happens? Guess what the Chinese do? 500,000 Chinese cross the Yalu River and invade North Korea. Volunteers. In fact, most of them didn't have weapons. The Chinese didn't have enough weapons for them. They were sent with the instructions to pick up the guns of the guys who were killed in front of you. All right? 500,000 Chinese volunteers in human waves. Now, I mean, just think, you're sitting there, you're an American. The boys are going to be home by Christmas, and all of a sudden you see this, and it's like a cartoon, right? You see these massive human waves. It's a whole new ballgame. And so you see these red arrows now. This is kind of the November northern counteroffensive, push the UN forces back below the 38th parallel again, all right?
This happens in November?
This is, November 1950. The initial phase, I don't want to go into this in too much detail. June through September, big northern offensive, almost takes over the entire peninsula. Mid-September through November, UN rallies, almost takes over the entire north. China intervenes and pushes the UN back. And then MacArthur rallies again in January, gets to the 38th parallel, gets a little bit north of it. Once more asks Truman if he can continue northward. This time, Truman says no. What does MacArthur do at that point? he publicly blasts Truman and says Truman is a wimp and he doesn't want to fight. There's no substitute for victory and da-da-da. And he becomes this big, kind of folk hero. Truman fires him. Everyone in the military supports Truman because MacArthur is kind of an egomaniac who's kind of on the loose, and he's rejecting this whole idea of civilian control of the military. I mean, Truman's the commander-in-chief. MacArthur comes home, has a huge ticker tape parade. It looks like the Yankees have just won the World Series. He goes down, Wall Street in New York, and people are cheering him, and he makes this speech in Congress, where he says, old soldiers never die, they just fade away. Hunter Thompson tells a funny story. He said he was a kid watching that, and he's looking at it saying, who is this crazy man, on TV? And MacArthur thought he'd become president, but basically he had this great folk following among the people, but everyone in D.C. and in the military thought he was a wingnut, and the guys in the military in particular came to Truman's defense. So he had to fire MacArthur. Basically, the Korean War, from that point on, nothing happens. From April 1951 until the armistice, nothing really happens. We'll pick this up in a minute.